Hope you're all doing well. My name is Stuart Graff. I'm the president and CEO at the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, and I'm speaking to you today from Phoenix, Arizona, where I understand you all have heat in Chicago that's competing with our heat right now, so we can all sort of commiserate together in air conditioning, but enjoy some Frank Lloyd Wright to pass the time and pass through the heat. I am a native Chicagoan. In fact, when Hillary and Eileen first invited me, we had a great conversation doing a little geography around JCCs. I grew up in the Hollywood Park neighborhood of Chicago, spent a lot of time in my youth at the Bernard Horwich JCC. And so it was really sort of a homecoming in a sense to be invited to do this program with you all. And I'm looking forward to talking with you tonight. I'm going to switch over and share my screen. And so hopefully you're all going to be seeing a slide with some pictures of Frank Lloyd Wright on the slide. So I am the CEO of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. The foundation is formed in 1940 by Frank Lloyd Wright himself. We're actually the only one of the Frank Lloyd Wright organizations that's founded by Wright. And the purpose is really around perpetuating his theory, something he calls organic architecture. And we're going to go through a little bit of his theory, and then we're going to spend some time talking about the two Frank Lloyd Wright properties that we own and that we're responsible for, which were Wright's homes and studios. Taliesin up in Wisconsin, and some of you may have attended the talk last week about Taliesin. We're not going to spend a lot of time because I understand it was covered last week. And then Taliesin West out here in Scottsdale. So let's dive in. If I can, let's see if we can, there we go. So last week you heard a little bit about Taliesin up in Wisconsin. Taliesin is built in 1911. This is after Wright has practiced in Oak Park. He's left Oak Park for a few years, spent time in Europe. And it's in Europe that he works on something called the Wasmuth portfolio. And I'm skipping over some biography because if you've been attending some of the other Wright sessions that the JCC is putting on, you've heard that, and I don't want to use your time covering old ground. But in 1908, he goes to Europe. He publishes a portfolio of his work known as the Wasmuth portfolio, and this portfolio of work really changes not only Wright's career, putting him on an international stage, but it also sets the stage for the development of modern architecture throughout the world. This culminated in a UNESCO World Heritage inscription for Wright's work, which again, we'll talk about a little bit later. But Wright comes back, and after the scandal of his divorce, his taking up with a mistress, he can't really go back to, well, it's not just divorce. He doesn't get divorced for a few years, but taking up with a mistress, leaving his family behind in Oak Park. He wants to escape somewhere, and he's looking for a place where he has the freedom to pursue his ideas, not only about architecture, but about an American ideal and a way to live. And he returns to the valley of his mother's family, known as the Lloyd Jones Valley in southwestern Wisconsin, about 45 minutes in a modern car, probably more like half a day back in his time, west of Madison, Wisconsin. And there he builds, in the rolling, unglaciated countryside, he builds Taliesin, a building that's been described as autobiography in wood and stone. Taliesin burns in 1914 as a result of a fire and murders that take place while Wright is in Chicago on business. It is rebuilt immediately thereafter and changed. And it burns again in the 1920s as a result of an electrical fire and is rebuilt. So what we're actually looking at here is what's called Taliesin 3. And what you see here is the origins of organic architecture, the way the building nestles into and becomes part of the landscape itself. That's what we often think of as the hallmark of Frank Lloyd Wright's work, is the way that buildings and landscapes interact with each other and become one. But Wright is also doing something else in his work. He's born in 1867, shortly after the Civil War ends, and he is immersed in the philosophy and the sense of a nation being formed and reformed after the Civil War. And so he starts to search for an architecture and a set of design principles that he calls uniquely American. This becomes the gospel in a sense of the transcendental movement. And at the Taliesin drafting studio, he has on the wall words from Ralph Waldo Emerson. What a man does, pardon the sexist language of the 19th century, what a man does, that he has. For a young man, and by by 1911, he's actually not so young a man. He's in middle age at that point. But this is what he sets out to do: is he tries to have an impact on the world. The notion that you simply do things for yourself, that you simply meet your own needs, that's not sufficient for Frank Lloyd Wright. He truly sets out to change the world, to change the way we build, the way we live, and to use this set of principles that he calls organic architecture to do so. And so at the drafting studio, where over the years, more than 1,000 of his apprentices worked. Imagine going to work every day, and this is at the door. What a man does that he has. That you can't just be contented to do a drawing for a client or for yourself. You have to have an impact on the world. That's what motivates Frank Lloyd Wright. By the 1930s, he is now in his late 60s, early 70s. For someone born in 1867, his lifespan, median lifespan, is about 40 years. So he is well past the time when he's supposed to have passed. But rather than simply fading away, no, he comes out to the desert. And he creates Taliesin West. And here's a beautiful night shot of the drafting studio at Taliesin West. As you can see, if we compare the two properties, these two places are as different from each other as night is from day. And it's at Taliesin West where Wright's ideas are really put to the test. You've heard from David Bagnall, if you attended that session, about the origins of the Prairie School. You've heard about the Prairie School and its relationship with nature. And so many of Wright's buildings were inspired by by Midwestern and East Coast landscapes. But something radically different happens when he comes out to the desert. So we'll talk about that a little bit in this presentation. So let's review a little bit about Frank Lloyd Wright. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on biography. But there's 70 years of bold experimentation. This is someone who was never content to rest on his laurels. This is actually why I got involved with Frank Lloyd Wright. I am not an architect or a designer. I have no drawing talent whatsoever. And I learned that at an early age. But I was fascinated by his buildings, and I was fascinated by the fact that in America, a man who doesn't graduate high school, has very little collegiate and formal training, can go on and revolutionize the world. A farm kid from Wisconsin can change the course of modern architecture throughout the world. And this sense of boldly experimenting, of always trying to have an impact, influenced me as a kid and has influenced generation after generation of people who look at his work and his life story. His work pioneered so many innovations. Some of you probably grew up in or live now in open floor plans, but before Frank Lloyd Wright, there was no open floor plan. The B. Harley Bradley House down in Kankakee, the Ward Willits House up in Highland Park are really the pioneering uses of the open floor plan. New systems for lighting, heating, cooling, other mechanical systems, the toilet that hangs off the wall instead of being on the floor. That's a Frank Lloyd Wright innovation. We all have heard about his cantilevers, think of falling water, and structural innovation. But there are actually dozens of structural innovations that he uses, turning things upside down, doing things in an unconventional way, all in order to achieve an impact of creating a more open and freer way to live, a way to connect visually and structurally out with the outside world. That's what he's focusing on. His work exists in 36 states. It was built in 3 countries. Sadly, there is no longer a building up in Canada, but his influence is global. There were 1,100 design structures. Over 500 were built, 432 remain, and 73 of them are open to the public for tours. So, so let's talk about what Wright was trying to do. This is a beautiful quote that is actually the vision statement for the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. The mission of an architect is to make life more beautiful, the world a better one for living in, and to give rhyme, reason, and meaning to life. Now, if that doesn't sound like the mission of what someone who designs buildings would do, would set for themselves, you're catching on, because he wasn't just an architect of buildings. He was an architect of ideas, ideas about how to live better, to live more humbly in the context of the natural world, to live as part of and inspired by the world around us. And that's, we're going to talk about some elements of that today. So transcendentalism, as I mentioned, is a big part of what he learns growing up. Walt Whitman and Ralph Waldo Emerson are all over Frank Lloyd Wright's map, often with physical inscriptions. What you see here is at Taliesin West. We call this Whitman Square. It's a concrete square that's about 8 feet on a side, and it's a fragment of Leaves of Grass and Thou America. I won't read the whole piece to you, but it's about an America that welcomes all, that embraces all. He writes here that the measured faiths of other lands are not for thee. And he's not talking about religion when he says the measured faiths, but rather the overall structure of society that says your future is determined by what family you were born into, maybe what ethnic group or religious group or tribal unit you were a part of, where your people came from. And America has none of that in Wright's view. It is by bringing everybody together, the value of the individual working in community with others, that's what's critical in Wright's world. And his studio would come to represent that. The other thing that you might see on the screen here is that we have some petroglyphs here. These are about 1,000-year-old Native American petroglyphs that are found at the site of Taliesin West. When Wright purchased the land, it was very important to him that these petroglyphs were there because they represented a group of people who, he didn't know if it was hundreds or thousands of years ago, but somehow lived in this inhospitable desert climate and thrived using nature as their only technology. And for someone who's inspired by the natural world, this was really critical for him. So he joins these two, in a sense, American stories, the transcendentalist tradition and the inspiration of the Native American using the natural American landscape as a source for thriving and innovation, as the entry point for coming into his studio, for understanding his ideas. So what are his ideas? Well, the first one is this idea of organic architecture. He never really defines exactly what this is. In fact, he wrestles with this over the course of his entire career. But it's this notion of a system, an ecosystem, in which buildings, nature, and human lives all interact with each other in a way that allows them to thrive. It's the sense of interdependence with nature. This is what's so important to him. So you'll see him all the time speaking about nature as if it was the most important thing in the world. Coming from a family of preachers, Unitarian ministers to be precise, he uses language like nature is the only body of God that we will ever see, a phrase that I find just absolutely beautiful and moving. And he's trying to figure out how we work with nature so that buildings and landscape become a blessing to each other instead of competing with each other. His story is an American story, this notion of self-expression and self-invention that embodies core concepts like liberty, equality, and democracy, and that celebrates the individual in the context of community. Again, we saw Wisconsin, so the sense of this connection with nature, his family history written throughout this valley, The ego that Frank Lloyd Wright is known for is a family tradition as well. Their family motto is truth against the world. But also this notion that the scale of the individual, the scale of the human being, bears this relationship to nature, and that has to live throughout the entire world, in all of the built environment and all of life. And then in Arizona, where he comes in 1938 to build Taliesin West, this is a story of reinvention. By 1938, his career is starting to rise again, but in the late 20s and early 30s, Frank Lloyd Wright was thought to be washed up or dead. It's with a few buildings like Falling Water, the Willie House, and the Jacobs House in Madison, Wisconsin, that he starts to become a celebrity, become known as an architect, and he uses that as the platform to change himself and change the world. And Arizona is the launch pad for it. I mentioned too that his story is a global story. Last year at this time, I had just come back from Baku, Azerbaijan, where we were successful in having Wright's work inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. And as you see here, the key part of this inscription is this idea that his work demonstrated an important interchange in the discourse that changed architecture on a global scale during the first half of the 20th century. It's for this reason that we often think of Frank Lloyd Wright as being one of America's first great cultural exports. It's not that our authors and others weren't known, but Wright's work, beginning with that 1911 Bosworth portfolio, fundamentally changed architecture and was one of the first American ideals that fundamentally influenced the world to move in a different direction from where it had been. We can't start to talk about Taliesin West without talking about Wright's fellowship. So the fellowship was his idea, along with Mrs. Wright, the third Mrs. Wright, in 1932, to form a school, to teach Wright's ideas about not only how to design and how to build, but how to form communities on these interdependent organic principles. And he'd been out here in Arizona in the 1920s, working on the Arizona Biltmore Hotel, and also working on a couple of other projects that were never realized. But that was his first exposure to the Native American petroglyphs. And there's one of these petroglyphs that hopefully you're going to be able to see where my cursor is. But it's this petroglyph that looks like a squared off spiral. If you're an architecture fan, it might look a little bit like the Greek key design, though it's different from the Greek key design. And Wright called that spiral the whirling arrow. He adopts that spiral as the symbol of his fellowship, because what he loves about it is it had a sense of being a set of clasped hands. If you can see me on screen, trying to put this up in front of the camera here, but it's sort of this idea of two hands clasping each other in strength. And he thought that was the perfect symbol of fellowship, of interdependence, that we would all work together to achieve a greater purpose that is, in his view, the hallmark American ideal. And so he spends a couple of months out here looking at land. He buys some land on the far east end of Scottsdale. Actually, it's about 13 miles out of what was then Scottsdale. Now it's the far east end of Scottsdale. And it's up on a mesa. We're up about 500 feet over the rest of the valley with mountains behind us, which we'll see. And he begins to take the fellowship out to Arizona from Wisconsin. This is a winter camp. So if you've not been out here, you'll notice the view of some of the buildings. They don't look like some of the polished Frank Lloyd Wright buildings that you see, because this was a desert campsite. It was never intended to be a refined dwelling or studio. It's all built by hand. What you see here are images from that very first winter of 1938. This image is actually taken in January 1938, where men and women who are members of the fellowship, there's about 30 of them in all, come out to Arizona and literally begin to clear the land. This is a pretty remarkable accomplishment, because you have to bring water into the site. There's no water. You have to have a generator. There's no electricity. There's nothing there but rocks and soil. So he sends a letter, a cable actually, back to Wisconsin that tells the apprentices to bring shovels and rakes and hoes, but also hose, two different kinds of hose, drawing boards and tools, a wheelbarrow, and a kohler, which is a generator, not a toilet, oil stoves for cooking and heating. But he also tells them, bring the violas, the cellos, all the rugs not in use, and whatever else we need, because this is going to be a civilized place. We are, as I mentioned, about 13 miles from Scottsdale. You had to take a dirt road to get up to Taliesin West as late as 1981, when I visited Taliesin West for the first time. I was out here visiting my college roommate's grandmother. His family was from out here. And I said, I gotta go out and see Taliesin West. So we rode our bicycles across the dirt roads of the desert and came up here. And this was the sign that would get you there. You'd see a few of these, Taliesin Road, Road to Taliesin, that were out there. The site, as he found it, was this raw place, raw geometry, stones and sharp edges. He sometimes described the sharp edges of the desert as the masculine counterpart to the smooth rolling hills and curves of his Wisconsin homeland. And he thought of this as, he actually says, this is like looking out over the rim of the world at the moment of creation. That's how raw this landscape was when he found it. To give you an idea of where we were and where we are, downtown Scottsdale is this little red box here, and Taliesin West is way out here in the mountains. And you notice there aren't roads here. So let's see if I can get this to work properly. But I wanted to share with you a sense of this landscape. So if Taliesin West is here, what you see beyond Taliesin West, and this is a present day map, what you see is how we are just all raw desert and mountain beyond Taliesin West. We are truly out on the edge of the world behind us. So let's see if I can go back now and make this work again. Okay, so this is Taliesin West as about 1943 or 44. As you can see, we are out in the middle of nowhere. It is raw desert all around us. These days we've got some homes in the nearby landscape. Wright is living in the quarters, sort of on the right side of this building. There are some residences for guests out on the edge of the property, and the drafting studio and his office are on the left side of the property. So where, you might ask, do all of these apprentices live? Well, I've highlighted in the red circles a couple of these triangular tents. They're actually pyramid shaped, and they are shepherd's tents. If you were an apprentice here, you lived in the desert. You didn't live in finished quarters. You came in, you worked, and you dined, and then you went out and slept in the desert. For Wright, this wasn't an act of cruelty. This was an act of learning from nature. You would learn from this landscape. The landscape had much to teach you. And this was a way of living very close to nature. Throughout the years, all of the apprentices, later the students in the architecture school, would also live in shelters that they built in the desert. We continue to have people who stay in the shelters in the desert, even though they're now a little bit better than tents. The building captures that raw geometry of the desert. There aren't a lot of smooth curves here. So this is taken probably about 1960. And again, even in 1960, there is nothing around. We're sitting in the middle of desert. At the time, we had about 1,100 acres of desert land preserved. Today, we have about 500 acres of desert preserved at Taliesin West. But what you see are some really interesting characteristics of the building. Um, we'll look at some of these closer up, but from this view, I want you to look at the angular geometry of the site and of the buildings, how it starts to reflect what you could see if we just back up the slide, the angular geometry of the mountains behind us. And as you'll see a little bit later on, you can see it a bit here, the angularity of the rocks and stones here. The rock at Taliesin West, and the stuff from which the buildings are actually made, is a unique volcanic rock. Geologically, it's referred to as Taliesin tuff because it's a unique type of rock that came out of the volcanoes that existed about 1 billion years ago just to our southeast. Maybe it's not 1 billion years. I'm saying that and I'm thinking that's not right, but just to our southeast in a community called Fountain Hills. The drafting studio you'll see here, and it looks a little bit different today, but the drafting studio was this open building. None of these buildings were sealed up with glass or air conditioning. All of these wooden panels could open and close to direct airflow and light, but they're all made of canvas, so the bright desert sun would just flow in a filtered fashion into the space and illuminate the space. Some other things that I hope you'll see, and I'll just point it out here and then try to come back to it in some of the later slides, but as you look at some of the mountains, you see all these arroyos that come down the mountain, these lines that as the monsoon rains come, they wash down the mountain and they form these channels. And here's the drafting studio with the mountains behind it and these beams that also form these same type of arroyo effect. So he's emulating nature. And the building is slung low to the ground, but angled up into the mountains so that the buildings and the site become one. The triangular pool that you see in front of us isn't just a mere decorative object. As I mentioned, his home in Wisconsin had already burned down twice. He'd also suffered through another fire in another building by this point in time. So this is the fire department because we are 13 miles from Scottsdale. The buildings are going to burn. They need water stored somewhere in order to put that fire out. Even today, we are not on water from the city of Scottsdale. We are on well water. There's an aquifer about 480 feet down below Taliesin that we draw our water from. But if we have a fire at Taliesin, there's a pump that's going to go right into that pond and start putting out the fire in the building. So that is still our fire department today. Here we're looking at the inside of the drafting studio. Again, you can see how rough this is. Even though we're in an open air space, there's a concert grand piano right there. He's not going to be without his music, just like he told the apprentices to bring the violas and the cellos. Well, there were pianos out at Taliesin as well. Everything is sort of rough. Nothing is polished because it is a camp, and he wants it to be that. What you're seeing here, however, goes on to influence modern architecture because these buildings become the turning point for the use of what were called primitive construction techniques and unrefined materials like rubble stone in modern architecture. This is where modern architecture, and particularly mid-century modern architecture, are born. The unusual shapes and dimension of buildings, the refusal to go with rectilinear spaces, to create soaring spaces, and wildly juxtaposed low and high geometries. This is what Wright is doing here, and it begins through his apprentices going out in the world to influence the world of modern architecture. This is also the place where hundreds of buildings are designed. Just a few of them, are noted here. But some of these buildings went on to, again, change the world. The Guggenheim Museum, probably the most influential museum building in the world up until the Guggenheim in Bilbao. Florida Southern College in Lakeland, Florida, the largest collection of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in one place. Marin County changes the whole idea of what a government building looks like and how it functions. This is a view outside the drafting studio. You can see these movable canvas panels have been opened up to take you out to the world. But now you start to see some things that look very Frank Lloyd Wright. These cantilevered beams that draw your eye out beyond the edge of the building and into the desert. You're inside when you look at this, but your eye is immediately drawn to the exterior world. And Wright is always using tricks, whether it's in his prairie school years with the long overhanging eaves or other work, he's always using tricks to play with us and to take our eye outside. And again, what do you see here? A boulder with native petroglyphs. They're placed around the site to remind you to have that respect for nature, and that what you think of as maybe primitive, a word that probably would have been used in the time to describe Native American work, Wright doesn't see as primitive at all. He sees it as insightful and brilliant because these people are learning from and emulating nature. Indeed, this is a 1,000-year-old story of habitation in the valley that we tell at Taliesin West. So once again, you see the native petroglyphs here, and now you're starting to get some good close-up views of the rubble stone construction, this sort of crude use of concrete to hold it all together. I will tell you, these walls are hard to build. We had to build new entry gates to Taliesin about a year and a half ago to keep people, when we're closed, further away from the property. So instead of being about 500 feet from the property itself, we've now got to move down the driveway about 3/4 of a mile. But I had to mix concrete by hand like they did back in the day and build walls, because we did it as a volunteer effort of outside volunteers and staff, just like they did back in the day. And this is tough work to build this by hand. When we transition over to the contemporary slides and the color, you'll see how beautiful this material is. But again, look at the way he is using these different angles to draw your eye in different directions. And look at that sight line through the pergola, right down the middle of this picture, and out down to those cinder cones, those volcanic cones, which you might not be able to make out in this photo, but that's what he's drawing your eye to. He's framing a view down to the landscape for you. The living room in Wright's private quarters. Again, open air, you've got light and air streaming in from the right-hand side, these canvas flaps that would open and close, and a ceiling similar to the drafting studio. It's really quite the breathtaking space. The architect, Philip Johnson, referred to it as the most beautiful room in America. And I will tell you that today it remains one of the most beautiful rooms in America. So it was glazed as air conditioning was added in the 1950s. The canvas roof panels were changed, and they're now fixed acrylic panels lined with canvas, so they still look very much the same from inside the building. But the buildings no longer move and flow with the time of day and the air. And we're in the process of a restoration project, and we're just at the beginning stages. This is partly funded by the National Endowment for the Arts to return these movable canvas panels and flaps, but use modern architectural fabrics that offer thermal insulation so we can continue to have air conditioning that will seal out the rain and allow us to continue to use the buildings year-round. You'll see some other things as well in this configuration. You'll notice these beautiful built-in light fixtures here. These line these interior gutters, so every one of these beams is actually a gutter. Those canvas panels would leak like a sieve, and we all know about Frank Lloyd Wright's leaky roofs. So where they would leak, they leaked into an interior gutter that extended through the exterior wall of the building and into the outside world. He also frames other views. So this is looking through a space that's called the breezeway, a space that's constructed to create its own weather. And his view now, his framing decision takes you down to these two little peaks known as the Papago Buttes. This is where the Desert Botanical Garden is. And it's the most striking thing in the landscape when you're on the site. And he's framed this beautiful vision for you. He's constructed this outdoor room and this outdoor painting. The Japanese working in woodblock drawings referred to this as the borrowed landscape. And he incorporates it in 3 dimensions in his work. We have beautiful spaces, theater spaces. This is the Cabaret Theater. It seats about 50, and it's used for formal dinners. This happens to be an opera performance. We collaborated with the Arizona Opera and invited some of their donors in. And we still use this for formal dinners, for donors, for members, for special guests, with live entertainment. It is an acoustically perfect space. He learned a lot when he was working on the Auditorium Theater in Chicago about acoustics, and created a space that looks a little grotto-like, but is actually brilliantly constructed. And this is our larger theater, the Pavilion Theater, seats about 110 people. This is used on the campus these days for dramatic performances. We're set up here for a jazz concert. We bring in performing artists from around the world and use the spaces as Wright intended. So one of the things we feel very strongly about is that part of our preservation work isn't just preserving the buildings, but it's also about preserving the values and life associated with the buildings. I mentioned the shelters that are built out in the desert and have been built out in the desert for years by the students and apprentices. This is a shelter from the 1960s that's built, and it actually extends into one of the arroyos on the property. So you can see these folks are living very close to nature, right in it. I mentioned the desert masonry construction, folding the desert floor as if to make it vertical. So you can see just how that effect is realized in the site, and how beautiful these desert stones are, mixed with this sort of rough concrete mixture. It's very sandy, very dry, and keeps this primitive sense of the place. Mrs. Wright said, as these buildings were being built, that it was less like a construction site and more like the excavation of an ancient ruin. We have, in the middle of this 500-acre preserve, we have the best view of the whole valley at Taliesin West. So I just wanted to share with you our gorgeous Arizona sunsets, what the desert looks like after the February rains, when some of those rains have turned to snow. This was taken in February 2019, when the snow came down about 3,500 feet. So I am standing right in the middle of Taliesin West, looking back on the McDowell Mountains. We have a lot of visitors at the site. I don't have a coyote up here, but we've got roadrunners up in the upper left-hand corner. We've got about a 6.5-foot rattlesnake that greeted me as I was coming into work last week. And these beautiful bobcats. This bobcat is sitting right outside my office. When I snap this photo, my dog who comes to work with me is barking at the bobcat trying to figure out what's going on here. I mentioned how Wright's career was changed by the natural landscapes. And I want to share with you an example of how the desert inspired him, not only with the geometric forms, but even the plant life. What we're looking at here is something called a staghorn cholla cactus. As the cactus grows, the stem starts to die, and it just becomes this fibrous skeleton, and you're seeing what that skeleton looks like here. Well, when Wright was trying to design the Johnson Wax buildings up in Racine, Wisconsin, he's looking for a way to open up the floor space, and he thinks about the staghorn cholla cactus. Here you've got this thin, hollow stem supporting this massive weight on top. And so he begins to design a refined form of the Johnson Wax building. You see here the plans for the hollow columns that are 9 inches at the base of the column that will expand out to many feet at the top. And no one believes him because they're not familiar with the staghorn cholla cactus. Building engineers said, you can't actually build a building with this. It won't stay up. So he does this experiment and loads tons and tons of weight, far above what the building inspectors require, to show just how strong these columns are, because he's using a solution that nature already created for him. He's just executing it in steel and concrete instead of fibrous material, but it's the same plan. He loads so much weight on this thing that he finally can't, there's no room to load anymore. And so they pull these struts away, and only after they pull these struts away does it become unstable and starts to crack. But they let them build the building. The building is an amazing building. It still inspires people to this day. And if you have a chance to get up to Racine, it is truly one of the most breathtaking spaces. So when they reopen for tours, you'll get to see some amazing work. They give a really good tour up there at Johnson Wax. And there's several other buildings that he designed for the family. The fellowship work is also on display. This is the work of Eloise Christa. Eloise, like so many of the apprentices, lived with us until she passed. We still have a handful of Wright's apprentices who started with us in the 40s, who live on the 2 Taliesin campuses. But Eloise wasn't an architect. She was a dancer and a sculptor, because the fellowship and Wright's work was not just about the architecture of buildings. It was about the architecture of community and society, and the arts played a central role. So we feature Eloise's sculpture all throughout our campus. We also have in our collections beautiful drawings by Wright and his apprentices, as well as his art collection, large Asian art collection, Gustav Klimt prints, just beautiful, refined work. And for us, this work continues on. Wright did not believe that either Taliesin property was finished. He wanted both properties to be explored as laboratories for his ideas. He says, actually, right near the end of his life, to his archivist, "What I've done here is a charcoal sketch. It's up to you to finish it when I'm gone." And so that's why we can look at replacing the roofs with new architectural fabrics instead of trying to recreate the past. Why we use marvelous new techniques, not only in our preservation work, but in some of the construction of the outbuildings, showcasing ideas, featuring lectures from architects. You can see some of this if you go to franklloydwright.org or follow us on social media, our Facebook page, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. You'll hear lectures and see how we continue to participate in the ideas that advance Wright's philosophy. As you know, our mission statement, and you're the first group seeing this because we haven't published this yet, but our mission statement we've recently revised. We inspire people to discover and embrace an architecture for better living through meaningful connections to nature, the arts, and each other. That's sort of our modern interpretation of that quote from Frank Lloyd Wright that I gave you at the top. And you can see more of Taliesin West on our webpage, and our friends at the JCC can explore this with you. But we actually used new innovative techniques to create the largest virtual architectural model that has ever been built. New technology also had to be created to display it. And it's on our website. You can look at this on any device. And just because we're going to run out of time, I want to share with you a little bit about what this is and how this works. But we captured with high resolution scans the entire interior and exterior of Taliesin West. So you can move around just by clicking on these little circles here, or you can move into different rooms. So we're going to go into Frank Lloyd Wright's office here, and you can start walking around and, you know, walking into the spaces. You know, you want to get a close-up on something, you can turn it around and go in and see. And if using this technology is not so comfortable for you, there's a little button in the lower left-hand corner that says play. It's a little arrow button like you see on a lot of technology, and it'll just run you through a tour all by itself. And you can just sit back and watch. And if you want to stop it, just click. And you want to resume the tour, just go back in. And it'll take you around and give you an idea of the site. We're really proud of this because this also makes, in a campus that's really tough to navigate because it is a rough desert landscape, it's really tough for people with mobility challenges to come. So this gives people an opportunity, whether they can't visit Scottsdale or they can't just make it because of the rough quality of the site. This gives them the opportunity to immerse themselves in the space, which is part of our commitment, is to make sure this site is accessible to everybody. So I just want to finish up here and we'll open up for questions, but you can take that guided 3D tour, or learn more, we've got a ton of information on our website. We're always adding new content to the website. You can do it at franklloydwright.org. And right now, while we're unable to visit, you can, if you become a member, you can get access to the Frank Lloyd Wright Quarterly. I'm not here to do a membership pitch, but if you find Wright interesting, take a look at that. But the other important thing is this: when we reopen, membership at the foundation and membership at some of the other Wright sites carries with it free admission, not only at the place where you bought it, but also if you become a member at a certain level or above, at 30 other Wright sites around the United States. So just something to think about. If seeing these presentations the last few days has been exciting to you, and you can't wait to see it in real life, this is the best bargain. And whether you buy it from the foundation or you buy it from the trust in Oak Park or whoever, well, we don't care. All of this is preserving this great American legacy, and we just want to encourage you to participate. Wright said, and remember, he dies in 59. He dies shortly before his 92nd birthday. But he said, the longer I live, the more beautiful life becomes. And that's a great quote, but I want to leave you with one other quote. And this came from one of his apprentices, who himself now is in his 80s. But the way Vern tells the story is this. He said, Wright's about 90 years old, and they're sitting talking, and he says, Vern, you know what I really like about myself? And Vern's thinking to himself, oh, here comes one of those statements that Frank Lloyd Wright is famous for, one of those arrogant, haughty statements. But what he actually said was this. He said, Vern, you know what I really like about myself? I'm 90 years old, and I still have the capacity to learn and change and do new things. And as I said, it's that spirit that is the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing. After a corporate career in Chicago, I came out here to do this because I just want to make this available for other people. And that's why I'm thrilled to answer any questions that you have. So thank you so much for your time, and I hope this has been interesting.
Stuart, thank you so much. It was interesting. And as we've talked before, I've been out there to visit your site, never up to Spring Green, which is a little bit closer for me, but it's exactly as I remember. So it's just beautiful. So we do have a couple of questions. One of them is, you use the term fellowship, and many times fellowship indicates a religious connotation, but that's not what Frank Lloyd Wright's fellowships were. Is that correct?
That's correct. In fact, every so often, I get asked if we are a Christian organization. Although Wright's descended from Unitarian ministers, they're very important in his life. He has, and he sometimes sort of preaches his theories of organic architecture. His religious practice is not something that is in any way, shape, or form something like an organized religious practice. In fact, one of my favorite things, and we'll be doing some lectures around this next year with Congregation Beth Shalom out in Elkins Park, a Frank Lloyd Wright site. We're actually doing a small exhibition of photography of Wright's sacred spaces, and I'll be giving a lecture around that. But that is the only building where Wright gives credit to somebody else as a co-designer, and that person is Rabbi Mortimer Cohen. Wright is so moved by his experience about learning about Judaism late in his life that he actually gives the rabbi credit, and it is a truly extraordinary building. I actually walk into that space, and I'm going to get emotional now. I tear up in that space because the floor is unlike any floor you've ever seen. It's taken from passage in Talmud where that the rabbi provided him that says, God is holding the congregation in the palms of his hands. And so the floor is shaped like two palms joined together. And so the floor slopes. It's a remarkable experience.
We had a tour of Beth Shalom on the 7th.
Oh, so, great.
Yeah.
Did Jill give that to you?
Jill hooked us up with Helene, and
okay. Helene's great.
Yeah,
they're good friends.
She got us into, it was really interesting.
Yeah, they're awesome out there. They're doing great work.
Yep, it was fun. Um, did Frank Lloyd Wright did he go out to Scottsdale with his thoughts already, or did he get there and then start planning?
So everything that Wright does is designed around the site. It's a reason why we no longer allow Frank Lloyd Wright's unbuilt works to be built, because they not only had to be designed around a specific site, but more importantly, as he got to see, whether it was himself or through his apprentices, how the building related to the site as it was being built, he would change the design to, again, borrow and incorporate elements of the landscape to see how the light flowed into the spaces. This is before computer software that can tell you exactly how the light's going to flow in. Back in his day, you actually had to be there. And so he does, so he probably had, having spent time out here, he probably had some ideas. And there are elements of the buildings that we see at Taliesin West that resemble the desert camp that he had in the 20s when he was working on the Biltmore, a camp called the Ocotillo Camp. And you can find more about Ocotillo on our website. But then a whole bunch of new ideas emerged because of the space that he actually wound up purchasing, the land and the material available there.
So Monona Terrace was finally built after he passed away, though, wasn't that
That's
what
correct.
we?
Monona Terrace is built in the 90s. It's built by Taliesin Architects, which was the practice that came into existence after Frank Lloyd Wright passed. And Taliesin Architects, much of its work was actually based on Frank Lloyd Wright's original designs, as well as new original works. Back in my lawyer days, I worked on a contract for a client with Taliesin Architects to build a building up in Waukegan, an office building for them. So it's funny how your life touches this this legacy in many ways. But
it was meant to be that you got involved with this.
Exactly. But there were about 20 buildings built after he passed. Some of them were buildings that he started, like Gamage Auditorium here in Scottsdale, actually in Tempe. Others, like Monona Terrace, started much later. As I say, we no longer authorize that because we believe, those are controversial works. There are people who walk into those buildings and say it doesn't have the same feeling. And that's because I think Wright, understood at a different level what he was doing, and those who tried to emulate him, especially if they didn't ever work with him directly, they just struggled. So good intentions, but maybe not the best results.
I think one of the most interesting things is, and given the time, there was not really any other way to get out there, but they drove, right? From
They not only
Green.
drove, but they would drive back and forth. So 6 months here in the winter and 6 months back in Wisconsin in the summer. And I've got to tell you, having done that myself, because I go between the properties, not for 6 months at a time, but Spring Green, with its humidity and its mosquitoes and the black flies, there are times when I'd rather be in the 115-degree heat here in the middle of summer. Oh, I have air conditioning now, so maybe I think of it differently. Wright said he had no use for air conditioning. Just wrap yourself in a wet sheet and you'll be fine. Don't do that. It's not the most pleasant experience.
But think about it. I mean, he didn't have a modern car like we had, an SUV or a minivan or whatever. I mean, that was a really long drive.
Oh, but he had these breathtaking 1940 Lincoln Continentals that he had customized that are beautiful, beautiful vehicles. And we've got some images of him, in convertibles, wearing his goggles and a little cap. For some of us, it reminds us of Snoopy cartoons. But it was also a way to travel across the country and be inspired by landscapes and go. He's building all over the country. So he might stop at a farmhouse that he's built out in the middle of Nebraska farmland, miles away from anything else, and stop and spend the nights and get to know that family. this was never an exercise for him in just constructing a building. Roland Risley, who is the only Frank Lloyd Wright original homeowner still in his house. Roland's 95, lives up in Pleasantville, New York, in a community called Usonia. Roland tells a beautiful story about being interviewed by Frank Lloyd Wright to find out what he wanted. Here's the man that's working on the Guggenheim Museum, and a young couple, their early 20s, come in and say, Mr. Wright, will you build a house for us? We don't have much money. And Wright is thrilled to do it. And you can listen to a podcast called 99% Invisible, and I'll send this off to Hillary. You can listen to Roland talk about this experience in his own words, because it's just lovely. And that's the way Wright worked with clients. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all anonymous experience. It was that connection between your life, the landscape that you inhabit, and building the home that would allow those things to thrive together.
Is there one thing or one building or one piece of furniture that he built that is your favorite?
Oh boy, that changes from day to day, and the building is usually whatever Wright building I happen to have visited most recently, because I'm just always overwhelmed. But I'll share, and Hillary, this is your fault because of our previous conversation before we got started. It's a pair of buildings. The Darwin D. Martin House, and I understand you had a presentation from that team, is built for the same family as a later house called Graycliff, built about 20 years later. The Darwin D. Martin House is built for Mr. Martin, who is an industrial magnate, as they used to say. And Graycliff is the country house, the summer house on the cliff over the lake, that's really built for Mrs. Martin. Mrs. Martin is going blind by the time that that this house is being built for her. She has to walk around with an assistant whose name I think was Aunt Pearl. And you see a house that's designed around her needs to get as much light as possible, to have space where she could walk comfortably with an assistant and not feel crowded or cramped in, and to have this connection to the outside world. And the city house built for him is designed to show people that he is this wealthy, successful, important citizen. So they're bits of biography, and together, like the two Taliesins, they tell this beautiful story over time, the story of the needs of individuals, or in the case of the Taliesins, the community of the fellowship and how it evolved. And that really gets to the thing I hope I leave you with today, that this isn't just a legacy of buildings. This is a legacy about thriving connection with each other, with landscapes, with the world. It's this American story of everybody realizing their best as an individual, but coming together in community through this connection to make our world a better place, to live in harmony with nature. That's, as the mission statement showed, that's what we're trying to do here with Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy. That's how we're trying to influence the architecture, design, and planning professions. And I hope that this has engaged you to think about your world a little differently and to think about those connections, especially at a time when so many of us have been locked in. Hopefully you have some connection to nature. My mother, who lives on the Skokie-Wilmette border, she has an outdoor terrace in her unit, but so many of people in her independent living community have just been locked in their apartments with a little cutout window to the world. She's been able to go outside. But if we would simply design in ways that embrace nature, all of us can do better, even in these toughest of times, find these connections. So we think Wright's work is more, and his ideas are more relevant than ever. And I hope you do too. So thank you.
This was great. And yes, the Martin House was gorgeous, and I am working to get a presentation from Graycliff. So hopefully we'll have further information about that coming soon. Stuart, thank you so much. This was fascinating. Like I said, I've been out there and it's wonderful. I will send an email tomorrow with a link to everyone who is on the call for the 3D tour. also amazing. So thank you everyone for joining us. We appreciate you. Stay safe, and we'll see you soon on one of our other programs that you can find at jccchicago.org.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
again. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.